From Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. The houses themselves were substantial and very decent. One could walk all round, seeing little front gardens with auriculas and saxifrage in the shadow of the bottom block, sweet williams and pinks in the sunny top block, seeing neat front windows, little porches, little privet hedges and dormer windows for the attics. But that was outside. That was the view onto the uninhabited parlours of the colliers' wives. The dwelling room, the kitchen, was at the back of the house, facing inward between the blocks, looking at a scrubby back garden, and then at the ash pits. And between the rows, along the long lines of ash pits, went the alley, where the children played and the women gossiped and the men smoked. So the actual conditions of living in the bottoms, that were so well built and that looked so nice, were quite unsavoury, because people must live in the kitchen, and the kitchens opened onto that nasty alley of ash pits. Mrs. Morell was not anxious to move into the bottoms, which was already 12 years old and on the downward path when she descended to it from Bestwood. But it was the best she could do. Moreover, she had an end house in one of the top blocks, and thus had only one neighbour, on the other side an extra strip of garden, and having an end house, she enjoyed a kind of aristocracy among the other women of the between houses, because her rent was 5 shillings and sixpence instead of 5 shillings a week. But this superiority in station was not much consolation to Mrs. Morell. She was 31 years old and had been married 8 years. A rather small woman, of delicate mould but resolute bearing, she shrank a little from the first contact with the bottoms women. She came down in the July, and in the September expected her 3rd baby. Her husband was a miner. They had only been in their new home 3 weeks when the wakes or fair began. Morell, she knew, was sure to make a holiday of it. It went off early on the Monday morning, the day of the fair. The 2 children were highly excited. William, a boy of 7, fled off immediately after breakfast to prowl round the wakes ground, leaving Annie, who was only 5, to whine all morning to go also. Mrs. Morell did her work. She scarcely knew her neighbours yet, and knew no one with whom to trust the little girl, so she promised to take her to the wakes after dinner. William appeared at 12:30. He was a very active lad, fair-haired, freckled, with a touch of the Dane or Norwegian about him. "Can I have me dinner, mother?" he cried, rushing in with his cap on. "'Cause it begins at 1:30, the man said so." "You can have your dinner as soon as it's done," replied the mother. "Isn't it done?" he cried, his blue eyes staring at her in indignation. "Then I'm going to be at it." "You'll do nothing of the sort. It'll be done in 5 minutes. It's only 12:30. "They'll be beginning," the boy half cried, half shouted. "You won't die if they do," said the mother. "Besides, it's only 12:30, so you've a full hour." The lad began hastily to lay the table, and directly the 3 sat down. They were eating batter pudding and jam when the boy jumped off his chair and stood perfectly stiff. Some distance away could be heard the first small braying of a merry-go-round and the tooting of a horn. His face quivered as he looked at his mother. "I told you," he said, running to the dresser for his cap. "Take your pudding in your hand, and it's only 1:05, so you were wrong. You haven't got your 2pence," cried the mother in a breath. The boy came back, bitterly disappointed for his 2pence, then went off without a word. "I want to go, I want to go," said Annie, beginning to cry. "Well, and you shall go, whining, wizening little stick," said the mother, and later in the afternoon she trudged up the hill under the tall ledge with her child. The hay was gathered from the fields, and the cattle were turning onto the Eddish. It was warm, peaceful. Mrs. Morell did not like the wakes. There were 2 sets of horses, one going by steam, one pulled round by a pony, 3 organs were grinding, and there came odd cracks of pistol shots, fearful screeching of the coconut man's rattle, shouts of the Aunt Sally man, screeches from the peep-show lady. The mother perceived her son gazing enraptured outside the Lion Wallace booth at the pictures of this famous lion that had killed a Negro and maimed for life 2 white men. She left him alone and went to get Annie a spin of toffee. Presently the lad stood in front of her, wildly excited. "You never said you was coming. "Ain't there a lot of things? That lion killed 3 men. I spent me tuppence, and look here." He pulled from his pocket 2 egg cups with pink moss roses on them. "I got these from that stall, where you have to get them marbles in them holes, and I got these 2 in 2 goes, 8 ago. They've got moss roses on. Look here, I wanted these." She knew he wanted them for her. She said, pleased. "They are pretty. Shall you carry 'em, 'cause I'm frightened of breaking 'em?" He was tip full of excitement now she had come, led her about the ground, showing her everything. Then at the peep show she explained the pictures in a sort of story to which he listened as if spellbound. He would not leave her. All the time he stuck close to her, bristling with a small boy's pride of her, for no other woman looked such a lady as she did in her little black bonnet and a cloak. She smiled when she saw women she knew. When she was tired, she said to her son, "Well, are you coming now or later?" "Are you going already?" he cried, his face full of reproach. "Already? It is 4:30, I know. What you going already for?" he lamented. "You needn't come if you don't want," she said. And she went slowly away with her little girl, whilst her son stood watching her, cut to the heart to let her go, and yet unable to leave the Wakes. As she crossed the open ground in front of the Moon and Stars, she heard men shouting and smelled the beer and hurried a little, thinking her husband was probably in the bar. At about 6:30, her son came home, tired now, rather pale and somewhat wretched. He was miserable, though he did not know it, because he'd let her go alone. Since she'd gone, he'd not enjoyed his Wakes. "Has me dad been?" he asked. "No," said the mother. "He's helping to wait at Moon and Stars. I seed him through that black tin stuff with holes in, on window, with his sleeves rolled up." "Ha!" exclaimed the mother shortly. "He's got no money, and he'll be satisfied if he gets his allowance, whether they give him more or not." When the light was fading and Mrs. Morell could see no more to sew, she rose and went to the door. Everywhere was the sound of excitement, the restlessness of the holiday, that at last infected her. She went out into the side garden. Women were coming home from the Wakes, the children hugging a white lamb with green legs or a wooden horse. Occasionally a man lurched past almost as full as he could carry. Sometimes a good husband came along with his family peacefully, but usually the women and children were alone. The stay-at-home mothers stood gossiping at the corners of the alley as the twilight sank, folding their arms under their white aprons. Mrs. Morell was alone, but she was used to it. Her son and her little girl slept upstairs, so it seemed her home was there behind her, fixed and stable. But she felt wretched with the coming child. The world seemed a dreary place where nothing else would happen for her, at least until William grew up. And the children, she could not afford to have a third. She did not want it. The father was serving beer in a public house, swilling himself drunk. She despised him and was tied to him. This coming child was too much for her. If it were not for William and Annie, she was sick of it, the struggle with poverty and ugliness and meanness. She went into the front garden, feeling too heavy to take herself out, yet unable to stay indoors. The heat suffocated her, and looking ahead, the prospect of her life made her feel as if she were buried alive. The front garden was a small square with a privet hedge. There she stood, trying to soothe herself with the scent of flowers and the fading, beautiful evening. Opposite her small gate was the stile that led uphill, under the tall ledge between the burning glow of the cut pastures. The sky overhead throbbed and pulsed with light. The glow sank quickly off the field. The earth and the hedges smoked dusk. As it grew dark, a ruddy glare came out on the hilltop, and out of the glare the diminished commotion of the fair. Sometimes, down the trough of darkness formed by the path under the hedges, men came lurching home. One young man lapsed into a run on the steep bit that ended the hill and went with a crash onto the stile. Mrs. Morell shuddered. He picked himself up, swearing viciously, rather pathetically, as if he thought the stile had wanted to hurt him. she went indoors, wondering if things were ever going to alter. She was beginning by now to realise that they would not. She seemed so far away from her girlhood. She wondered if it was the same person walking heavily up the back garden at the Bottoms as had run so lightly up the breakwater at Sheerness 10 years before. "What have I to do with it?" she said to herself. "What have I to do with all this? Even the child I'm going to have, it doesn't seem as if I were taken into account." Sometimes life takes hold of one, carries the body along, accomplishes one history, and yet is not real, but leaves oneself, as it were, slurred over. "I wait," Mrs. Morell said to herself. "I wait, and what I wait for can never come." Then she straightened the kitchen, lit the lamp, mended the fire, looked out the washing for the next day and put it in to soak, after which she sat down to her sewing. Through the long hours her needle flashed regularly through the stuff. Occasionally she sighed, moving to relieve herself, and all the time she was thinking how to make the most of what she had, for the children's sake. At 11:30 her husband came. His cheeks were very red and very shiny above his black moustache. He nodded slightly. He was pleased with himself. Waiting up for me, lass. I've been helping Anthony, and what d'ye think he's gen me? Nowt but a lousy £half-a-crown, and that's every penny." "He thinks you've made the rest up in beer," she said shortly. "I haven't. That I haven't. You believe me? I've had very little this day. I have and all." His voice went tender. "Here, I brought thee a bit of brandy stap, and a coconut for t' children." He laid the gingerbread and the coconut, a hairy object, on the table. "Nay, thou never said thank you for nowt I did in me life, did you?" As a compromise, she picked up the coconut and shook it to see if it had any milk. "It's a good un, you may back your life for that. I got it fra Bill Hodgkinson. 'Bill,' I says, 'thou none want them 3 nuts, dost thou? Are it agin me one for a bit of a lad and wench?' 'I am, Walter, me lad,' he says. 'Tay which one of them 'tis a mind.' And so I took one, and thanked him. I didn't like to shake it afore his eyes, but he says, 'Thou'd better make sure it's a good un, Walt.' And so you see I knowed it was. He's a nice chap, is Bill Hodgkinson. He's a nice chap. A man will part with anything so long as he's drunk, and you're drunk along with him," said Mrs. Morell. "Eh, thou mucky little hussy, who's drunk, I should like to know," said Morell. He was extraordinarily pleased with himself because of his day's helping to wait in the moon and stars. He chattered on. Mrs. Morell, very tired and sick of his babble, went to bed as quickly as possible, while he raked the fire.